they stood barely up to the kneecaps of the galactic elite. When the first Terran delegates walked into the Grand Assembly, the room erupted into a deafening chorus of clicks, barks, and guttural laughter. To the towering titans of the cosmos, humanity was nothing more than a fragile punchline, a microscopic anomaly that had somehow stumbled out of its solar system. But the laughter died the day the doors blew open, and the galaxy's most feared apex predator, a beast that had conquered 1,000 worlds, dropped to one knee, looked the tiny human dead in the eye, and rumbled, "Little brother." The journey of the USC Magellan was not a tale of elegant gliding through the stars, but one of brute force survival. Powered by a Lockheed Martin fusion plasma drive and navigated by a quantum artificial intelligence designed deep within the subterranean laboratories of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the ship had torn a bleeding hole through the fabric of spacetime. Humanity had not discovered the hyperlane network gracefully. They had detected the gravitational anomalies using the James Webb Space Telescope decades prior, spent 50 years arguing over the data, and finally hurled a ship at the anomaly with the sheer stubborn audacity that only Earth could produce. When the Magellan dropped out of faster-than-light travel and approached Aegis Prime, the diplomatic hub of the Orion Cygnus Arm Commander Roman Faraday felt the collective weight of 8 billion human souls resting on his shoulders. He adjusted the collar of his dress uniform. Beside him, Dr. Elizabeth Harding, the lead exobiologist recruited from MIT, was rapidly tapping a stylus against her datapad, her eyes wide as she took in the colossal architecture of the alien station. "They aren't answering our hailing frequencies on the standard United Nations extraterrestrial contact protocols." Elizabeth muttered, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "In fact, according to the telemetry, their automated docking systems are trying to classify us as a stray microasteroid. The ship is too small for their standard docking clamps. Override the automated system." Roman replied, his voice a steady baritone that betrayed none of his internal anxiety. "Transmit the prime sequence again. We didn't cross 40 light years just to get bounced off the windshield of the galactic community." When they finally managed to secure a berth in a maintenance bay, the only space small enough to accommodate the Magellan, the reality of the universe hit them like a physical blow. The gravity on Aegis Prime was roughly 0.4 Gs, a fraction of Earth's standard 9.8 meters per second squared. As Roman and Elizabeth stepped out of the airlock, escorted by 4 heavily armed United Earth Marines, they felt impossibly light. But that physical lightness was immediately countered by the crushing psychological weight of their surroundings. Everything was gigantic. The corridors were 60 feet high. The doors were massive reinforced bulkheads designed for creatures of mythic proportions. And then there were the aliens themselves. The welcoming committee consisted of the Vori, the self-appointed bureaucrats of the Galactic Assembly. The Vori were towering, elegant creatures standing an average of 12 feet tall. They possessed an extra set of arms, elongated craniums, and skin that shimmered like crushed pearls. They moved with a languid, arrogant grace, looking down quite literally at the human delegation. Prime Minister Vorlag, the head of the Vori delegation, leaned forward, adjusting a translation device over his mandibles. When he spoke, the synthesized voice echoed through the cavernous docking bay, dripping with a condescension that transcended the language barrier. "Is this the entirety of it?" Vorlag asked, gesturing a long, multi-jointed finger toward the human group. He let out a noise that sounded like grinding stones, which the translation software helpfully interpreted as amused scoffing. When the perimeter buoys detected a warp signature from the designated dead zone, We expected a newly enlightened species. Instead, it appears the universe has sneezed a colony of microbes into our sector. A chorus of clicks and barks erupted from the Vori guards. Laughter. It was an unmistakable universal sound of mockery. Roman felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained perfect military discipline. He had been briefed by the best psychologists at DARPA. They had warned him that first contact would likely be fraught with misunderstandings, but no one had predicted that humanity would be treated like a literal joke. I am Commander Roman Faraday, representing the United Earth government. Roman projected his voice, ensuring it carried through the thin lower pressure atmosphere of the station. We have achieved faster than light travel. We have mapped our local cluster. We are here to formally request a seat at the Galactic Assembly. Vorlag lowered his massive head, bringing his compound eyes within a few feet of Roman's face. The alien smelled of ozone and synthetic nectar. A seat, my tiny creature, you would need a booster chair just to reach the voting terminal. Your ship is held together by primitive kinetic welds. Your biology is unshielded, entirely reliant on a heavily calcified endoskeleton, and your height. Well, it is a miracle you haven't been crushed by the atmospheric pressure of a gentle breeze. Elizabeth stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her apprehension. With respect, Prime Minister, our height is a direct evolutionary adaptation to the extreme gravitational and environmental pressures of our homeworld. We are highly efficient. Vorlag waved a dismissive hand, nearly knocking a Marine backwards with the sheer air pressure displaced by the movement. Save your squeaking for the archive drones. The assembly is currently in session. You may observe from the gallery, provided you do not get stepped on. Come along, humans. Let us show the galaxy its newest pets. As the delegation was herded down the colossal hallways, Roman caught the eyes of his Marines. They were seasoned veterans, men and women, who had fought in the lunar resource wars and survived the harsh training camps of the Martian colonies. They didn't like being patronized, and they certainly didn't like being laughed at. The ridicule didn't stop in the hallways. As they entered the Grand Assembly, a vast amphitheater-like chamber, large enough to house a small city, the appearance of the tiny humans caused a disruptive ripple of amusement. Hundreds of species, all giants compared to the Terrans, paused their debates to stare, point, and chuckle. Holographic screens zoomed in on Roman and his team, displaying their height metrics in bright mocking colors alongside the galactic average. They were seated in a small glass-enclosed observation box meant for minor planetary functionaries. It was humiliating. Every time Roman tried to access the communication terminal to register Earth's presence, the automated system rejected his biometric inputs, prompting a message that the terminal was not calibrated for substandard limb length. "This is a disaster," Elizabeth whispered, watching as a group of massive gelatinous diplomats below made pantomimes of squishing something small between their appendages to the uproarious laughter of their peers. "They aren't taking us seriously. They think we're a fluke of evolution. Let them laugh," Roman said, his voice cold, his eyes scanning the architectural weaknesses of the room out of sheer habit. "Arrogance breeds complacency. We survived the ice ages, the world wars, and the collapse of our own biosphere. We can survive a few tall jokes." But Roman knew the situation was dire. In a galaxy ruled by titans, a species that couldn't demand respect would quickly be exploited, subjugated, or worse, ignored entirely, until a mining conglomerate decided to pave over Earth for its raw minerals. Humanity needed a paradigm shift. They needed something or someone to change the narrative. They were about to get exactly that. The laughter within the grand assembly came to an abrupt, terrifying halt. It did not fade out slowly. It was cut off with the instantaneous precision of a guillotine. One moment the chamber was a cacophony of alien dialects and diplomatic posturing. The next, an absolute suffocating silence descended. Roman stood up, pressing his hands against the glass of the observation box. Below, the massive Vori diplomats were backing away from the central aisle. The gelatinous species that had been mocking them seemed to shrink, retracting into their protective shells. The air temperature in the room plummeted, the environmental scrubbers working overtime to compensate for a sudden influx of heavily oxygenated freezing air. "What's happening?" Elizabeth asked hastily, checking her datapad. Her eyes widened as the sensors spiked. "Commander, I'm reading a massive biological signature entering the hall. The hormonal output, it's pure cortisol and adrenaline. The entire room is radiating fear." "Look," Roman pointed toward the massive, heavily fortified blast doors at the far end of the chamber. The doors shrieked in protest as they were forced open, not by the automated hydraulic systems, but by massive clawed hands. Through the threshold stepped a creature straight out of a primeval nightmare. This was the Kalan. Even among the giants of the galaxy, the Kalan were anomalies. The entity that strode into the room stood nearly 15 feet tall, an imposing amalgamation of apex predatory traits. Its body was entirely covered in overlapping carbon black armored scales that absorbed the ambient light. It possessed a bipedal stance, but its musculature was so dense, so obscenely powerful, that every step cracked the reinforced polysteel flooring. Its head was wolf-like, but entirely alien, featuring an elongated snout, 4 glowing binocular eyes, burning with predatory intelligence, and a jawline packed with serrated teeth, capable of snapping a titanium beam in half. The Kalan did not wear elegant diplomatic robes like the Vori. It wore heavy-scarred battle armor, adorned with the physical trophies of conquered worlds. The Kalan Ra, a nearby alien functionary, whispered, his voice trembling so violently the translator matrix struggled to process it. "Warlord Torak, the Apex, god of the blood sands." Roman had read the fragmented data the JPL probes had picked up over the years. The Kalan were the undisputed masters of the galaxy's violent outer rim. They were a species that evolved on a Category 9 death world, a planet so hostile that the very flora was acidic, and the fauna constantly engaged in a brutal evolutionary arms race. The Kalan had not just survived their world, they had battered it into submission, and then they had taken to the stars. They were the muscle of the Galactic Assembly, the ultimate deterrent. No species had ever engaged the Kalan in open warfare and survived. They only respected strength, endurance, and the capacity for violence. Warlord Torak walked down the center aisle, the silence so profound that the heavy rhythmic thud of his steps echoed like a war drum. He approached the central podium, brushing aside a massive Vori security guard as if the alien were made of paper. The guard didn't dare protest. Prime Minister Vorlog, who had been so arrogant just an hour prior, now looked visibly diminished. His shimmering skin had turned a dull, frightened gray. He bowed deeply, his mandibles quivering. "Warlord Torak." Vorlag stammered the translation software, picking up the micro-tremors in his vocal cords. "The Assembly is honored by the presence of the Kalan. We have prepared the tribute for the Outer Rim mining sectors as requested." Torak did not immediately answer. He let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated the glass of the human observation box. His 4 glowing eyes scanned the room, dismissing the trembling politicians with obvious disgust. Vorlag, desperate to break the suffocating tension and ingratiate himself to the apex predator, decided to offer a distraction. He pointed a long, shaking finger upward toward the observation box holding the human delegation. "We also have a rare amusement today," mighty Torak, Vorlag said, forcing a hollow, sycophantic laugh. "A newly discovered species from the uncharted sectors. They call themselves humans. They are microscopic, fragile things. We were just discussing which zoo sector to place them in. Perhaps the Kalen would enjoy a few for their biological exhibits. They are quite amusing to look at. Their bones are tiny, their ships are primitive, and they barely reach our knees." A few of the braver alien delegates let out nervous chuckles, hoping to join in the joke and appease the warlord. Roman felt a cold fury settle in his stomach. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. "Hold your ground," he quietly ordered his Marines, who had instinctively reached for the grips of their kinetic pulse rifles. "Do not engage unless fired upon." Warlord Torak turned his massive armored head. His 4 eyes locked onto the glass observation box. The nervous laughter in the room died instantly. Torak didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. The massive predator tilted his head, a gesture of intense, hyper-focused curiosity. His nostrils flared, drawing in the atmospheric data, processing the scent of the room. Then, ignoring Vorlag entirely, Torak stepped away from the podium. He walked toward the observation box. "He's coming up here," Elizabeth whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Kalen warlord didn't bother using the stairs. He bent his massive digitigrade legs and leaped. The sheer kinetic force of his jump shattered the floor tiles beneath him. He landed on the elevated gallery with a deafening crash right in front of the human delegation's glass enclosure. Torak stared at the tiny humans through the glass. He raised a massive armored fist and slammed it into the reinforced barrier. The glass, designed to withstand a micrometeorite impact, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, raining down onto the gallery floor. Roman Faraday did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the terrifying visage of the giant predator towering over him. The Marines flanked him. Weapons subtly angled their training, overriding their primal fear. The entire Grand Assembly held its breath. Vorlag covered his eyes, fully expecting the Kalen warlord to tear the tiny creatures to bloody shreds for the sheer sport of it. It would be a messy cleanup, but at least the warlord would be entertained. Instead, the unimaginable happened. Warlord Torak loomed over Commander Roman Faraday. The sheer size difference was comical, yet the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The Kalen's hot metallic-smelling breath washed over Roman's face, carrying the scent of raw meat ozone and ancient violence. Torak leaned in closer, bringing his terrifying scar-crossed snout mere inches from Roman's chest. The predator was performing a biological analysis, bypassing the station's rudimentary sensors in favor of his own highly evolved senses. Torak heard it first. In a room full of aliens whose circulatory systems were racing in panic, whose multi-chambered hearts fluttered with terror, the tiny human's heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic, terrifyingly calm cadence. It was the heartbeat of a creature that recognized danger but refused to yield to it. It was the pulse of a pursuit predator. Then Torak processed the scent. He smelled the iron-rich blood, a heavy, dense fluid required for survival in a high-gravity environment. He smelled the microscopic traces of cortisol perfectly balanced by an aggressive spike of adrenaline, a chemical cocktail designed not for flight, but for violent, sustained fighting. The warlord's binocular eyes zoomed in on Roman's physical structure. Where the giant Vori had seen fragile, tiny bones, Torak's specialized vision saw reality. He saw a skeletal structure compacted and hardened by the relentless crushing gravity of an unclassified death world. He saw muscle fibers woven tightly together, designed for stamina rather than burst strength. He saw a creature built to outlast, to endure, to march until its enemies simply collapsed from exhaustion. Torak's eyes flicked to the United Earth Marines. He saw the way they stood. They were not cowering. They had assumed overlapping fields of fire. Even in the face of a 15-foot-tall monster that could bite them in half, the tiny humans were mathematically calculating how to kill him. It was a mirror. For 10,000 years, the Kalen had ruled the galaxy because they were the only species born in the crucible of a high-gravity, hyper-lethal world. The rest of the galaxy was soft. They evolved on gentle garden worlds, built their empires through trade, and bought their security. The Kalen were lonely at the top of the food chain, surrounded by prey that disgusted them. Until this exact moment, Torak realized what the ignorant fools of the assembly had missed. Earth was not a mistake. It was a pressure cooker, and the tiny furious creatures standing before him were not prey. They were concentrated, weaponized survival. Slowly, deliberately, Warlord Torak stepped back. The assembly, watching in absolute silence, braced for the slaughter. Vorlag leaned forward, his mandibles twitching in anticipation. Instead of raising a claw, the giant, terrifying Kalen warlord did something that had not been recorded in the annals of galactic history. He shifted his massive weight, lowering his right leg until his armored knee hit the shattered floor with a heavy, resonant thud. He bowed his massive, terrifying head, exposing his vulnerable neck in a universal gesture of ultimate respect. When Torak spoke, he did not use his species' roaring battle cant. He activated his own translator, ensuring that his words would be broadcast clearly across the entire Grand Assembly. "Your gravity is crushing," Torak rumbled, his voice shaking the very air. "Your world bleeds you from the moment of birth. I smell the ash of 1,000 wars on your skin. I see the predator's calculus behind your eyes." He looked up, meeting Roman's unflinching gaze. "They laugh at your size because they do not understand density." Torak continued, his glowing eyes narrowing as he cast a disdainful glare toward the trembling Vori Prime Minister below. "They mistake your compressed mass for weakness. They do not know what it takes to climb out of a gravity well that wants to snap your spine. But we know." Torak extended a massive armored fist, stopping just inches from Roman's chest. It was a warrior's salute. "We thought we were alone in the dark," the apex predator rumbled softly. "Welcome to the hunt, little brother." The silence in the Grand Assembly shattered. It was not broken by laughter this time, but by a collective horrified gasp that echoed across 100 different species. Prime Minister Vorlag collapsed backward into his hover chair, his shimmering skin turning a sickly, translucent white. The gelatinous diplomats who had mocked the humans moments before were now desperately trying to evacuate the hall. The universe had fundamentally shifted in a matter of seconds. Humanity was no longer a cosmic joke. They had just been officially recognized, claimed, and respected by the harbingers of death themselves. Roman Faraday, commander of the tiny, ridiculed Magellan, looked at the giant fist hovering before him. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He slowly raised his own hand, forming a fist, and tapped his knuckles against the unyielding armor of the Kalen warlord. "Glad to finally meet you," Roman said calmly. "It's been a long walk from Earth." Warlord Torak let out a sound that the galaxy had never heard before. It was a deep, chest-rattling boom that made the very foundations of Aegis Prime vibrate. It took the automated translation matrix several seconds to process the sound. When it finally flashed across the holographic screens, the galaxy froze in sheer terror. The apex predator was laughing. And for the first time in history, he wasn't laughing at the humans. He was laughing with them. The Grand Assembly of Aegis Prime had been designed to intimidate. Its soaring archways of spun polyglass and amphitheater seating were meant to make newly discovered species feel infinitely small. But as Warlord Torak, the apex of the Kalen, stood shoulder to shoulder with Commander Roman Faraday, the architecture suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. The physical size of the human delegation had not changed yet. In the eyes of the galactic elite, their shadow now stretched across the entire chamber. Torak turned his massive armored bulk toward the central podium, gesturing for Roman to follow. The Kalen did not ask for permission to take the floor. He simply claimed it, the heavy thud of his digitigrade boots acting as a gavel that silenced any lingering whispers. Prime Minister Vorlag of the Vori, still clutching the edges of his hover chair, looked as though he might vomit his synthetic nectar. The bureaucratic giant frantically tapped at his console, trying to summon the Assembly's automated security drones. But Torak shot him a single withering glare that froze the Prime Minister's elongated fingers mid-air. The Charter of Ascendancy. Torak boomed his synthesized voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. States that any species capable of independent faster-than-light travel and possessing a Class A planetary defense matrix is entitled to a prime seat. My little brothers have demonstrated the former. The latter I will personally vouch for. Vorlag swallowed hard, his mandibles clicking in a nervous, erratic rhythm. Warlord Torak, please, reason must prevail. The humans, he spat the word as if it tasted foul, are unverified. Their vessel, the Magellan, is a patchwork of primitive kinetic shielding and volatile fusion drives. They do not even use standard zero-point energy. They burn plasma. It is a miracle they did not incinerate themselves. Furthermore, their integration requires a multi-cycle probationary period. It is the law. Roman Faraday stepped forward. He barely reached Vorlag's shins, but he projected his voice with the crisp, commanding authority honed in the naval academies of Annapolis. Prime Minister, Roman said, his tone razor-sharp. Our fusion drives, developed by Lockheed Martin and calibrated by our local quantum AI networks, cross the same 40 light years your zero-point ships cross, and we did it in a fraction of the time. We didn't glide on the hyperlanes. We punched a hole through space-time and dragged ourselves through it. If our technology offends your sensibilities, it is only because it bypasses your monopolized infrastructure. Elizabeth Harding, standing just behind Roman, didn't miss a beat. She pulled a heavy, ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook from her satchel, a device retrofitted with a DARPA-engineered quantum decryption core. She jacked a universal bypass cable, a piece of hardware designed by Palantir Technologies, for hostile cyber warfare, straight into the Assembly's localized data port. In fact, Elizabeth added, her fingers flying across the tactile keyboard, I'm looking at the Assembly's public technological archives right now. Your standard kinetic barriers are designed to deflect energy weapons. Lasers, plasma, photon bursts. Highly elegant. She looked up, a dangerous smirk playing on her lips. But your shields are entirely blind to uncharged high-velocity mass. If we fired a depleted uranium slug from a standard Raytheon railgun, your ships wouldn't even register the impact until it tore through your life support systems. A wave of horrified murmurs washed over the alien delegates. The Vori military attachés in the gallery frantically consulted their datapads, their shimmering skin turning a panicked shade of violet as they realized the tiny human scientist was absolutely correct. Torak let out another terrifying rumbling laugh. "Do you hear that, Vorlag? The tiny ones have been in our halls for less than a cycle, and they have already calculated how to crack our dreadnoughts in half using nothing but dense rocks." The warlord slammed his fist onto the podium, cracking the marble. "They are not prey, they are a weapon, and they will have their seat." Desperation flared in Vorlag's compound eyes. He could not allow this. If the humans were given a prime seat, they would have voting power, resource rights, and worst of all, the direct protection of the Kaelin. The carefully balanced hierarchy of the galaxy, where the Vori ruled through bureaucracy and soft power, would be shattered. "Warlord, with absolute respect." Vorlag countered, his voice trembling, but laced with venom. "A species cannot be granted a prime seat based solely on potential violence and the patronage of the Kaelin. The Charter demands a physical demonstration of biological fortitude in a standardized environment. You claim they are survivors of a death world. Let them prove it. If they are truly your little brothers, they must survive the rite of the deep." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The rite of the deep was a barbaric, archaic loophole in the Assembly's laws, originally designed to execute dangerous warlords under the guise of a trial. Torak's 4 glowing eyes narrowed into hostile slits. He leaned down, his massive jaws inches from Vorlag. "You dare invoke the deep, you intend to send them to Sector 4. "It is the law," Vorlag squeaked, terrified, but stubbornly holding his ground. "If they are apex, they will survive. If they are the fragile microbes they appear to be, the universe will correct its mistake." Torak slowly turned to Roman. The Kaelin did not look worried. Instead, there was a glimmer of intense, savage anticipation in his eyes. "Sector 4 is the unmaintained underbelly of this station," Torak explained softly to the human commander. "It is where the station's gravity generators malfunction, spiking the pressure unpredictably. It is also where the Tarnid, a vicious syndicate of reptilian mercenaries, nest. Vorlag is sending you into an ambush. I am legally forbidden from interfering in a rite." Roman adjusted the cuffs of his dress uniform. He looked back at his 4 United Earth Marines. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Evans, a veteran of the Martian uprisings, simply racked the charging handle of his Heckler & Koch kinetic pulse rifle, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. Roman looked back up at the towering Kaelin. "Warlord, where we come from, we call that a target-rich environment. The descent into Sector 4 was like stepping into the rusting industrial bowels of a mechanical beast. The pristine, sweeping architecture of the upper levels vanished, replaced by exposed plasma conduits, dripping coolant lines, and shadows that seemed to swallow the dim, flickering emergency lights. Roman Elizabeth and the 4 Marines moved in a tight, practiced diamond formation. The air here was heavy, thick, with the smell of sulfur and unwashed biological mass. "Gravity fluctuations detected," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes glued to the telemetry on her tough book. "The Vori are manipulating the artificial gravity in this sector. It's spiking. 0.8 Gs. Now 1.2 Gs. They're trying to pin us to the floor before the attack." Gunnery Sergeant Evans let out a short, cynical laugh. 1.2 Gs, that's just a brisk Tuesday training run at Fort Bragg Dock. Keep your eyes on the shadows. Vorlag had assumed that the humans, being so small, would be crushed by the sudden increase in gravitational pressure. What the Vori did not understand was that humans evolved on Earth, a planet with a baseline gravity that was considered universally oppressive. A spike to 1.2 Gs merely made the Marines feel like they were wearing heavy backpacks. It did not slow them down. It grounded them. The ambush was sprung without a sound. From the ceiling gratings and the massive ventilation shafts, the Tarnid descended. They were terrifying creatures 8 feet of sinewy reptilian muscle covered in jagged camouflage scales. They possessed 6 limbs, the front, 2 terminating in scythe-like bone blades that dripped with a highly corrosive neurotoxin. They moved with terrifying speed, designed to overwhelm and dismember their prey in seconds. There were at least 30 of them. "Contact front and vertical," Evans barked. The Tarnid expected the tiny mammals to freeze in terror. They expected easy slaughter. Instead, they met the unyielding mechanized fury of United Earth doctrine. The Marines didn't just open fire. They executed a perfectly synchronized overlapping kill box. The deafening roar of the Heckler and Koch kinetic pulse rifles shattered the silence of Sector 4. Unlike the energy weapons of the alien species, which cauterized as they burned the human weapons, fired solid caseless tungsten rounds at hypersonic speeds. The first Tarnid to lunge at Roman never even touched the ground. 3 tungsten rounds punched through its hardened scales as if they were wet tissue paper, the sheer kinetic transfer shattering its internal organs and throwing its massive 8-foot frame backward into the bulkhead with a sickening crunch. "Watch the flanks," Roman shouted, drawing his sidearm, a heavy caliber Sig Sauer designed to crack powered armor. He fired twice, dropping a Tarnid that had tried to flank Elizabeth, but there were too many, and the corridors were too tight. The Tarnid realized that the tiny weapons were lethal, so they changed tactics, dropping directly into the center of the human formation to engage in brutal close-quarters melee. A massive Tarnid warrior landed directly in front of Sergeant Evans, its bone scythe swinging down to decapitate the Marine. Vorlog, watching the telemetry from the safety of the upper levels, waited for the human to be sliced in 2. Instead, Evans did the unthinkable. He didn't retreat. He stepped inside the creature's guard. Taking advantage of his smaller stature and the incredibly dense musculature built by Earth's gravity, Evans dropped his rifle, letting it hang on its tactical sling, and launched his entire body weight upward. He drove a reinforced carbon-plated combat boot straight into the alien's knee joint. The joint snapped with a crack like a gunshot. As the giant reptilian roared in pain and buckled forward, Evans pivoted, driving a devastating right hook into the Tarnid's lower jaw. Human bone density, combined with the extreme velocity generated by Earth-adapted muscle fibers in a lower gravity environment, turned Evans's fist into a sledgehammer. The Tarnid's jaw didn't just break, it completely detached the kinetic force of the blow, dropping the 8-foot apex predator unconscious to the metal grating. "They're brittle," Evans shouted, a wild, adrenaline-fueled grin on his face. "These giants are hollow, break their joints." The skirmish turned from an ambush into a systematic dismantling. The humans moved like blurs. They were too small to be easily targeted by the cumbersome Tarnid, and too dense to be knocked away. When a Tarnid blade did strike a Marine's body armor, the V-shaped ceramic composite trauma plates designed to stop armor-piercing bullets simply deflected the alien bone blades, shattering them on impact. Within 4 minutes, Sector 4 was silent. 22 Tarnid mercenaries lay dead or incapacitated on the deck. The remaining 8 had fled back into the ventilation shafts, clicking in absolute terror at the tiny indestructible demons that had slaughtered their pack. Roman stood amidst the carnage, his breathing steady, ejecting a spent magazine from his sidearm and smoothly slamming a fresh one home. He looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the corridor. He didn't say a word. He just stared directly into the lens, knowing Vorlog was watching. A heavy rhythmic thud echoed from the far end of the corridor. The heavy blast doors groaned open, and Warlord Torak stepped into the dim light. The Kalen looked at the devastation. He looked at the shattered bodies of the feared Tarnid mercenaries, and then he looked at the 5 tiny humans who hadn't sustained a single casualty. Torak threw his head back and let out a roar of absolute triumph. "The rite is complete," Torak bellowed, his voice carrying through the station's comms network. He walked over to Roman, looking down at the human with a terrifying, bloodthirsty pride. "You fight like cornered badgers, little brother. The assembly will never sleep soundly again." "We don't like being cornered," Roman replied, holstering his weapon. "Now I believe we have a seat to claim." The atmosphere in the Grand Assembly had undergone a seismic shift by the time Roman and his team returned from Sector 4. The laughter was a distant memory. In its place was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. When the tiny humans walked back down the central aisle, still covered in the corrosive blood of the Tarnid mercenaries, the giant alien delegates practically climbed over each other to get out of their way. Prime Minister Vorlag sat slumped in his hover chair, utterly defeated. The right of the deep was legally binding. By surviving it, Earth had bypassed a century of bureaucratic red tape. The Vori could do nothing but watch as Torak personally escorted Roman to a newly materialized, albeit comically large, prime seat at the center of the chamber. But the victory on the assembly floor was only the beginning. 3 hours later, far away from the prying eyes and panicked whispers of the bureaucrats, Roman and Elizabeth found themselves aboard the Blood Sands warlord Torak's personal dreadnought. The ship was a monument to brutalist engineering, built entirely out of dark, radar-absorbing alloys and powered by captive star cores. The gravity inside the dreadnought was set to 1.1 Gs, a comfortable, familiar weight for the humans, but a crushing pressure that kept standard alien diplomats from ever visiting the Kalen. Torak sat at the head of a massive obsidian tactical table. The ambient lighting was low, casting terrifying shadows across the warlord's scarred features. He poured a dark, viscous liquid into a chalice the size of a bucket and drank deeply before activating the hollow projector in the center of the table. "You proved your worth today, Roman Faraday," Torak rumbled, dropping the honorifics. "You shamed the Vori and broke their enforcers. But I did not claim you as little brother merely to embarrass politicians. I claimed you because the Kalen need you." Elizabeth, sitting next to Roman, raised an eyebrow. "An apex predator species that rules the outer rim needs our help with what we've barely left our solar system." Torak's glowing eyes darkened. He tapped a command into the console, and the holographic projector flared to life, displaying a chaotic, swirling mass of red and black energy at the very edge of the galactic map. "For 10,000 cycles we have defended the border of this galaxy." Torak began, his voice devoid of its usual booming arrogance. It was replaced by a grim, exhausted solemnity. "We protect the soft creatures of the assembly, though they despise us for it. But 5 cycles ago, a new threat emerged from the deep void. We call them the Scourge." The hologram zoomed in, revealing nightmarish imagery captured by Kalen scout ships. The Scourge were not a singular species. They were a parasitic hive-mind biomechanical horrors that swarmed planets, consuming everything down to the bedrock. They do not fight us in open space. Torak explained, his massive claws gripping the edges of the table. They burrow. They embed themselves in the planetary crusts in the subterranean caverns and in the micro-tunnels of ruined cities. They radiate a localized suppression field that rapidly drains stamina. When my warriors deploy, our size works against us. We cannot fit into their hive tunnels. We get bogged down. The scourge swarm our legs, drag us down into the dark, and consume us piece by piece. Torak looked directly at Roman. The Kalen are the hammer, Torak said. But you cannot kill a swarm of subterranean parasites with a hammer. You need a scalpel. You need a creature small enough to navigate the tightest, most claustrophobic tunnels. A creature with an endoskeleton dense enough to withstand crushing ambushes. A creature with the stamina to fight for days in toxic high-gravity environments without resting. Roman's eyes widened as the tactical calculus fell into place. He looked at the holographic readouts of the scourge tunnels. They were roughly 7 feet in diameter, perfectly sized for a human in standard General Dynamics heavy infantry exosuits. You want us to be your tunnel rats, Roman said softly. You want Earth to supply the shock troops to clear the hives while your fleet provides the orbital bombardment and heavy surface armor. Yes, Torak rumbled. The soft species of the assembly could never survive it. Their bones would snap in the high gravity zones. Their minds would break in the dark. But I looked into your eyes today, human. I smelled your blood. Your species thrives in the dark. You were forged in the crucible of a world that constantly tried to kill you. Elizabeth pulled up the logistical data on her tough book, her mind racing. If we agree to this alliance, Earth will need access to your slipspace networks. We would need to integrate our SpaceX Starship logistical platforms with your orbital carriers. We would need raw materials to scale up our munitions manufacturing by a factor of 10. If you fight beside us, Torak slammed his fist against his chest armor, a resonant metallic boom. The Kalen will grant you unrestricted access to the outer rim mining sectors. We will share our armor smithing. We will ensure that no Vori bureaucrat or Tarnid mercenary ever sets foot in your solar system. You will not be pets of the assembly. You will be the vanguard. Roman Faraday stood up. He walked to the edge of the tactical table, staring into the swirling red hologram of the scourge threat. He thought of the billions of people back on Earth, struggling over dwindling resources, completely unaware of the massive, terrifying universe that had just opened its doors to them. They had come to Aegis Prime, hoping to beg for a seat at the table. They were leaving as the most highly valued military asset in the galaxy. Roman looked up at the towering 15-foot apex predator. Warlord Torak, Roman said, a cold, predatory glint in his eye that mirrored the alien's own. Draft the treaty, send us the coordinates of the first hive, and tell your massive fleet to clear a path. Earth is going to war, Torak smiled, exposing rows of terrifying serrated teeth. He reached across the table, extending his massive hand. Roman met it, grasping the giant armored thumb in a warrior's grip. In that dark, heavily pressurized room, the ultimate alliance was forged. The galaxy had laughed at the tiny humans mistaking their size for weakness. But the predators knew the truth. It wasn't the size of the beast in the fight. It was the density of the bone, the fire and the blood, and the absolute terrifying capacity for violence. The universe was about to learn that the most dangerous things often come in the smallest packages. The joint operational staging ground above the colony world of Tartarus IV was a terrifying testament to the new galactic order. Kalen Dreadnought's massive jagged ships, built from dark light-devouring alloys, hung in low orbit like mechanical leviathans. Amidst these giants, the United Earth contingent looked almost comically small. A fleet of retrofitted SpaceX logistical cruisers and heavily armored Boeing troop transports had successfully navigated the Kalen slipspace corridors, bringing the very best of Earth's military-industrial complex to the front lines. Down on the surface, the Scourge had already consumed 50% of the planetary crust. The once lush agricultural world had been transformed into a nightmare of jagged biomechanical spires and deep pulsating sinkholes. Aboard the Kalen flagship, Warlord Torak stood beside Commander Roman Faraday. The holographic tactical table projected the planetary surface swirling with red hostile indicators. The surface is a meat grinder. Torak rumbled, his 4 eyes narrowing as he watched a Kalen heavy infantry battalion get bogged down by a swarm of Scourge drones. My warriors are holding the primary LZ, but the Scourge are adapting. Their biological armor is thickening against our plasma barrages and the subterranean suppression fields. Torak pointed a massive clawed finger at a localized dead zone on the map. Right there, a Class 5 hive node. It is emitting a biofrequency that causes my warriors' twin hearts to suffer catastrophic arrhythmia. We cannot push deep enough to plant the thermal charges. Roman studied the map, his mind rapidly processing the tactical geometry. He turned to Dr. Elizabeth Harding, who was rapidly typing on a ruggedized console directly integrated into the Kalen mainframe via a proprietary Palantir uplink. "Elizabeth, how does that suppression field interact with our biology?" Roman asked, his voice deadpan. "It shouldn't theoretically," Elizabeth replied, pushing a lock of hair out of her eyes. "The Scourge field targets multi-chambered low-pressure circulatory systems, forcing them into overdrive. But the human cardiovascular system is a high-pressure closed-loop engine designed for sustained aerobic and anaerobic exertion under Earth's crushing gravity. To put it simply, Commander, their suppression field operates at a frequency that might at worst give you a mild migraine and a slightly elevated heart rate. It's essentially the biological equivalent of drinking 3 espressos." Torak looked at the tiny human scientist, a low rumble of amusement vibrating in his massive chest. "You are immune to their terror song." "We are immune to a lot of things," Roman said, turning to Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Evans, who was currently checking the action on a massive rotary barrel weapon system. "Sergeant, tell the Boeing dropship pilots to spin up the APU. We're doing a halo drop right down the throat of the hive node." Evans grinned, a feral, terrifying expression. "Ura, Commander, the boys brought the heavy toys for this one. No lasers, just good old-fashioned kinetic hate." 10 minutes later, the skies above Tartarus 4 screamed. The Kalen watched in bewildered awe from their bridge as a dozen tiny matte black United Earth drop pods detached from the Boeing transports. They didn't glide down gracefully on anti-gravity thrusters. They plummeted like heavy iron stones propelled by solid rocket boosters, tearing through the planet's atmosphere at terminal velocity. "They are coming in too fast," a Vori observer brought along to witness the inevitable failure of the humans shrieked from the corner of the bridge. "The deceleration G-force will turn their tiny organs to paste." Torak just grinned, exposing his serrated teeth. "Watch." At exactly 2,000 feet, the pods deployed advanced Northrop Grumman retro thrusters, originally designed for Mars atmospheric entry. The sheer kinetic shockwave of their sudden deceleration shattered the Scourge biospires below them. The pods slammed into the soft, pulsating flesh of the hive's central crater, burying themselves deep into the muck. Before the Scourge defenders could swarm the impact craters, the explosive bolts on the pod doors blew. Out stepped the vanguard. The United Earth Marines were clad in next-generation General Dynamics heavy infantry exosuits. The armor didn't make them giants, they were still barely over 6 feet tall, but it compacted their already dense frames with layers of reactive ceramic plating and woven carbon nanotubes. "Knock, knock," Evans growled over the comms. He leveled his weapon, a GEM-134 minigun modified to fire depleted uranium armor-piercing sabots. As the first wave of Scourge drones, nightmarish amalgamations of chitin, razor-sharp scythes, and acid-spitting maws lunged forward, the Marines opened fire. The deafening roar of kinetic ballistics shattered the alien landscape. Unlike the Kylan plasma, which the Scourge had evolved to absorb the sheer physical mass of the hypersonic tungsten rounds, tore through the alien carapace like wet paper, turning the advancing swarm into a mist of green ichor and shredded chitin. "Keep the perimeter tight," Roman ordered, drawing a massive custom-built combat shotgun loaded with explosive breaching slugs. "Push for the primary tunnel, we're going underground." The descent into the Scourge hive was a descent into hell. The tunnels were barely 7 feet wide, walls lined with a slick, bioluminescent resin that smelled of rotting copper. For a Kalan entering this space would have required crawling on their bellies, unable to swing their massive weapons. For the humans, it was a perfectly sized kill box, entering the suppression field radius. Elizabeth's voice crackled over the tactical net from orbit. "Vitals are holding steady. Commander, the hive node is sensing your presence. It's spiking the frequency. It's trying to induce cardiac arrest." "Copy that," Roman replied, his breathing perfectly regulated. "Evans, how's the squad feeling?" "Slightly annoyed, sir," Evans replied, driving a combat knife straight upward through the soft underbelly of a Scourge stalker that had dropped from the ceiling. "And maybe a little claustrophobic. Let's plant the package and get out of this sewer." As they pushed deeper, the true horror of the Scourge became apparent. The walls were lined with the bio-harvested remains of other species. Towering husks of Kalan warriors, their armor dissolved, and their biological mass integrated into the hive's neural network, hung suspended in the resin. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a massive subterranean cavern. In the center pulsed a grotesque, towering structure of meat and neural tissue, the Class 5 hive node. Surrounding it was the hive guard. These were not standard drones. These were massive, heavily armored centurions spliced with Kalan DNA. They possessed the sheer size and strength of the apex predators, but the mindless, coordinated savagery of the Scourge. "Contact front," Roman yelled, raising his weapon. "Focus fire on the joints, they're top-heavy." The cavern erupted into a storm of gunfire. The centurions charged the ground, shaking under their massive weight. One of them broke through the defensive line, its scythe-like arm swinging down to cleave a Marine in half. The Marine didn't dodge. Using the servo motors of his General Dynamics exosuit and the insane baseline density of his earth-forged skeleton, he stepped into the swing, caught the alien's descending arm with both hands, and planted his boots firmly into the ground. The kinetic transfer was immense. The ground beneath the Marine's boots shattered, sinking him 3 inches into the rock, but he did not buckle. The Scourge Centurion let out a screech of mechanical confusion as its downward momentum was completely halted by a creature 1/3 its size. "Break it!" Evans roared. The Marine twisted his torso, the hydraulic servos in his suit whining as he snapped the Centurion's arm at the elbow joint. As the beast recoiled, Evans stepped up and unloaded a point-blank burst from his rotary cannon directly into the creature's exposed, unarmored thorax, dropping the giant monstrosity instantly. But the hive node was not defenseless. Realizing physical attacks were failing, it unleashed its ultimate weapon, a localized psychic assault, a concentrated burst of telepathic trauma designed to shatter the minds of the attacking species and assimilate their consciousness. A wave of invisible, crushing energy hit the squad. The air went cold. The tactical comms filled with a high-pitched, agonizing screech. Aboard the flagship, the Vori observer gasped in delight. Ah, the psychic wave! No species can withstand the hive's mental intrusion. They will turn their weapons on themselves in madness. Torak gripped the console, his heart's pounding. "Hold the line, little brothers," he whispered. Down in the cavern, Roman dropped to one knee, clutching his helmet. The Scourge hive mind ripped into his consciousness, expecting to find the clean, orderly mental pathways of a civilized spacefaring species. Instead, the Scourge mind connected directly to the chaotic, heavily compartmentalized, trauma-hardened psyche of a human raised on Earth. It encountered the generational genetic memory of survival against apex predators, ice ages, plagues, world wars, and the relentless grinding pressure of gravity. Furthermore, the DARPA-engineered neural lace implanted at the base of Roman's skull detected the unauthorized neuroelectric intrusion and violently rebooted his sensory cortex, creating a massive neural feedback loop. The hive mind screamed. It wasn't a physical sound, but a psychic shockwave that rippled backward from Roman's brain straight into the central node. The Scourge, accustomed to terrorizing soft minds, had just bitten into a mental buzzsaw. The massive fleshy structure of the node shuddered its bioluminescence, strobing erratically as the sheer chaotic willpower of human stubbornness fried its delicate neural pathways. Now, Roman grunted, blood dripping from his nose as he shook off the psychic recoil. Plant the BAE charge. Evans sprinted forward, slamming a heavy cylindrical device, a BAE system's localized antimatter charge, directly into the pulsating, paralyzed flesh of the hive node. He twisted the arming mechanism, and a red countdown timer illuminated the dark cavern. 3 minutes, Evans yelled. We have 3 minutes to be anywhere but here. Fall back, move, Roman ordered. The retreat was a blur of adrenaline gunfire and burning muscle. The human squad sprinted back up the tunnel, their boots pounding against the resin-slicked floor. Earth's gravity had blessed them with stamina that alien species found biologically impossible. They didn't tire. Their bodies simply shifted into anaerobic overdrive, flooding their systems with a secondary burst of adrenaline. They burst out of the tunnel mouth just as the Boeing dropships hovered overhead, dropping heavy woven steel recovery cables. The Marines locked their harnesses onto the cables. "Punch it!" Roman screamed into the comms. The dropship's engines roared, yanking the tiny humans into the sky, with bone-jarring force accelerating straight up into the atmosphere. Deep beneath the surface, the BAE antimatter charge detonated. It wasn't an explosion. It was an erasure. A massive section of the planetary crust simply caved inward, followed by a blinding flash of blue-white light that shot up through the tunnel shafts. The localized shockwave leveled the remaining biospires on the surface, instantly vaporizing the Scourge presence in Sector 4. Aboard the Kalen flagship, absolute silence reigned. The sensor readouts showed the hive node was completely obliterated. The localized suppression field vanished. The Scourge forces on the surface, suddenly cut off from their central intelligence, devolved into mindless, uncoordinated insects, easily mowed down by the advancing Kaelan infantry. The Vori observer was hyperventilating his shimmering skin, pale and terrified. Warlord Torak stood tall, his chest swelling with an immense, terrifying pride. He keyed his long-range comms broadcasting on all open galactic frequencies. "The Vanguard holds the line," Torak's voice boomed across 1,000 star systems. "The node is destroyed." When Commander Roman Faraday stepped back onto the polished obsidian floor of the Kaelan flagship's bridge, he was covered in alien ichor, his exosuit scorched and dented, and he looked entirely exhausted. He removed his helmet, wiping a streak of dried blood from his upper lip. The giant Kaelan Bridge crew warriors, who had spent their entire lives revering nothing but size, strength, and dominance, stopped what they were doing. Slowly, deliberately, the massive aliens turned toward the tiny human. One by one, they brought their right fists across their armored chests, a booming, percussive wave of absolute respect. Warlord Torak walked forward, his heavy footsteps shaking the deck plating. He looked down at Roman, his glowing eyes entirely devoid of their usual terrifying malice. "You defied the deep. You cracked the hive," Torak rumbled softly. "You carry the fire of a dying star in your veins, Roman Faraday." "Just doing our job, Warlord," Roman replied, cracking a tired, grim smile. "You point at the target, we break it. That was the deal." Torak let out a rumbling laugh that vibrated in Roman's chest. "And you broke it well. Today the Scourge learned fear, not the fear of the hammer, but the fear of the scalpel that cuts in the dark." The aftermath of the Battle of Tartarus IV sent shockwaves through the entire galactic assembly. The impossible telemetry data was broadcast to every civilized world. A squad of unaugmented tiny mammals from an unclassified death world had completely dismantled a Scourge hive node, a feat that had previously cost the Kaelan thousands of lives and heavy dreadnoughts. Within 48 standard hours, the political landscape of the galaxy was completely rewritten. Prime Minister Vorlag of the Vori attempted to block Earth's ascension to the prime seat, citing reckless use of unsanctioned antimatter weaponry. He was immediately ousted from his position, not by the Kaelan, but by a sudden terrified coalition of minor species who realized that humanity was the only thing standing between them and the Scourge. They didn't want bureaucrats protecting them anymore. They wanted the Vanguard. When the United Earth delegation finally took their permanent place in the Grand Assembly, they did not sit in the glass observation box. They were given a central podium constructed not of spun glass and elegant filigree, but of heavy utilitarian earth steel, flanked on all sides by Kaelan honor guards. Humanity's integration into the galactic community was not a tale of cultural enlightenment or peaceful exploration. It was a hostile takeover, orchestrated through sheer unapologetic competence. With Kaelan slipspace technology, Earth's industrial output exploded. Lunar shipyards began producing hybrid dreadnoughts, Kaelan armor, and slip drives paired with human kinetic artillery and Palantir-driven targeting, AIS. Earth became the premier training ground for the galaxy's elite. Alien species paid exorbitant sums just to send their special forces to observe human training regimens at Fort Benning and the Siberian wastes, though most washed out within a week, entirely unable to cope with the crushing gravity and the relentless borderline psychopathic endurance of human instructors. Through it all, the bond between the massive Kaelan and the tiny humans only deepened. They were a bizarre pairing giants of muscle and terror, walking side by side with creatures that barely reached their kneecaps. But in the trenches in the dark, and in the blood-soaked mud of 100 different worlds, they found a kinship that transcended biology. They were the children of the death worlds. They were the ones who did the dirty work so the rest of the galaxy could sleep. Years later, during the final campaign against the Scourge homeworld, Roman Faraday, now a decorated fleet admiral, stood on the bridge of the newly christened USC Thorax Vengeance. The flagship was a marvel of combined engineering, dwarfing even the old Kalan dreadnoughts. Warlord Torak, his armor heavily scarred from 100 campaigns, stood beside him, resting a massive hand on the console near Roman's shoulder. "They used to laugh at you," Torak rumbled, looking out at the massive combined fleet of human and Kalan ships preparing to jump into slipspace. "They called you microbes, pets." Roman looked up at the towering apex predator, his oldest ally in the dark expanse of space. "They don't laugh anymore," Roman said quietly, his eyes fixed on the target coordinates. "No," Torak agreed, a terrifying predatory grin spreading across his face, exposing his serrated teeth to the starlight. "Now they prey." The galaxy thought humanity was a punchline, but they quickly learned that true strength isn't measured in inches. It's measured in the density of your bones and the sheer unyielding willpower to survive the crucible of a death world. If you loved this HFY sci-fi journey, where the ultimate apex predators recognize the relentless spirit of humanity, hit that like button and smash. Subscribe. We have